Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to Next Door Netadmin. This one's going to be a little bit on the shorter side, but I thought I would just take a moment to talk about planning. How do you plan a project? What's involved in planning a project? What are some of the ways that you can plan a project? Part of that's going to depend on the exact project that you're planning. Some things will be relatively simple, of course, and some things will be fantastically complicated. But there's a few different techniques that you can use to plan something, and I'll share the ones that work for me. But right out the gate, I want to acknowledge that it can look remarkably like you're not doing anything at all. So if you're going to use some of these particular techniques, if they work for you, if they don't work for you, don't use them. But if they do work for you, you need to make sure that your employer understands that this is part of the planning process and that they're okay with that. It's not an excuse to just shirk off or not do your work. It's actually part of the process, but it may look like you're not doing anything to the untrained eye, hence the title for this video about, am I a bad employee? Am I just a time waster? So when I'm approaching a new project, something that is complicated, has a lot of moving pieces, I'm not sure exactly how to do this, it's not something I've done a whole bunch, I'm going to start by reading. And I'm going to continue by reading a lot of things. And that reading alone can just be masses of time spent staring at a website. 4 or 5 different pages that I'll just have open, and I'll just be reading and rereading and rereading and rereading, and I'll read it over and over and over and over. Sometimes I'll read it over and over for weeks, sometimes months. And the process of reading this is not just to read the material. The reason for reading this is to keep adding into my own head the factors of what needs to be considered, what are the items that need to be balanced against each other. And over time, if I have the time and space to just kind of keep reading this, and all the pieces start to slowly assemble themselves in my head, and I can develop a picture of what this project, this system is going to look like. What are the essential attributes? How is it going to function? What's the user experience going to look like? How can it fail? How can I make it more resilient against failure? All of these things just kind of have to slowly be given enough time to gel, essentially, in my own head. And only when I've got that to a place where it's kind of sort of gelled, at least a little bit, then I can move on to the next phase of a project, which is actually experimentally starting to do things. And for this, I find there's no real substitute to just going ahead and doing it. If you have the capability, this is a great thing to use a lab environment for. Spin up some virtual machines if it's some software that you're trying to configure. If it's hardware, you may just have to jump right in and start configuring equipment to figure out how to actually make it work. Hopefully without affecting anything in production. That's the big key. We're trying to avoid impacts in production wherever possible because those are not good. But yeah, you might need to play around with it, experiment with it a little bit, and try a few things out. The experimental phase of a project is one where people can see you're actually doing something. Whereas if you're just sitting there reading things all day, or even just sitting and, thinking, for me, I'll often have my eyes closed, because if my eyes are open, I'm busy looking around. If my eyes are closed, then I'm assembling pictures in my head and figuring out how that works. For some people, a whiteboard might be the perfect way to do it, or even just a piece of paper. Sketch out, the picture that you're looking at, draw arrows if that helps. There's different ways depending on how you see things, whether it's entirely visualized in your head or whether you need to have a whiteboard or a notebook or some other sort of sketchbook to sketch it live. They're all fine. They're all valid. Find what works for you. The experimental phase is something that, you're actively working on stuff, but at the end of it, you may not have anything to show for it other than, I now have a better idea of how I'm going to actually do this when it's time to deploy the live project. And so this is, to an extent, an area where you have to be willing and able to trust, as an employer, you have to be able and willing to trust the creative process, as it were. Yes, there's a creative process in networking. I know it's computers. How can there be? No, there's definitely a creative process to putting things together, and I'm sure I've talked about that before. But there's going to be time spent in creating and generating this project. There's going to be time spent with experimentation and figuring out what works, what doesn't work, what are the pitfalls, what are we trying to avoid, all of those things. And the more complicated and the more complex the project, the more time is going to need to be spent in reading, planning ahead, designing a layout, figuring out what factors do we actually need to look at, what are the knobs that we can tweak to, increase memory, decrease memory, increase CPU, decrease CPU, all the bits and pieces, whether you're provisioning a single server or whether you're deploying a complicated service that requires 4 to 6 to 8 servers in various places. It all starts with figuring out the plan, then refining the plan through experimentation to figure out those details, and then you move to actually deploying it. And at this point, before you deploy, in between your experimentation and your deployment phase, you should have a clear enough picture to be able to go through and list out all the things that you're thinking that you're going to need to do and when you're going to need to do them. What are the conditions that are necessary for doing this? What are the signals that you're going to be looking at to tell if it's time to do this, or whether it's time for you to say, you know what, we should not continue at this point and we should backtrack. Because there's always the possibility that you might need to backtrack. If something's suddenly going unexpectedly off the rails, there's a possibility that you might need to backtrack. There's also the possibility that in order to figure out what the problem is, you have to keep going forward. Because if you take a piece of equipment that isn't working the way that you thought it should, and you just take it out, well, If this was something that you had seen in experimentation, you'd already know how to deal with it. You may or may not be able to replicate that failure condition in an experimental environment. If you can't, then the only way to troubleshoot it is in the live environment. And so there are instances, regrettable though they are, where your only way to solve a problem is to keep the problem there so that you can study it and break it down and fix it. Easier said than done. Sometimes you can't do that. And if it's a large and impactful thing, you may have no choice but to backtrack. If it comes down to, I'm going to have the internet gone for 3 days while I figure this out. You can't take a business offline completely for 3 days. It doesn't work like that in today's world. You're going to have to figure something out. On the other hand, if it's just, the internet will be slow for a little while and things will be glitchy while I figure out what's causing the glitch and get rid of it. Okay. And then you're looking at something that is essentially random. It's not something that was caught in testing. It's not something that was caught in experimentation. And it's a degradation of service rather than a service outage. And so that's the kind of thing that you might be able to work through. But nonetheless, before you start deploying, you should have a plan. You should be able to say, these are the conditions under which we're going to keep pushing ahead. These are the conditions under which we're going to backtrack and figure out how to come at this again in another way. If you can list out all the steps that you plan to take and you have a plan for recovering if something goes unexpectedly wrong, then you have gotten yourself to a point where you're as prepared as you can be. And that's the goal of planning a project, is to be as prepared as you can be. Have the picture, do the reading, create the picture in your head, and then experiment, refine it, figure out what you can and cannot do in practice, and then put the plan together and do your best. But yeah, the opening parts of that can look remarkably like you're not doing anything. But as long as your employer knows that you are working on it and you actually have something to show them, if you can explain to them the picture that you've created, the factors that you're considering, and then at the end of experimentation, you actually have the plan, that's the proof that you have been doing the work on that. And that takes time. All of this takes time. If you're dealing with a lot of other regular support level stuff, yeah, this might take a lot more time, because for me at least, I find that I need longer periods of time, bigger chunks of time to actually sit and think through all the complexities. It's not something I can do on 5 minutes here, 10 minutes there, maybe a whole 15 if I'm lucky. Usually it doesn't work that way for me. So figuring out exactly how it works for you, that'll be up to you to some extent. Hopefully you found that little insight into how I approach planning a new project to be useful. Maybe it had some interesting thoughts in there for you to consider and possibly put to use for yourself. In any case, thank you very much for watching. I am your next door net admin, and we will see you next time.